Hello, my name is Joshua Graf, and this is the New York Times vs. United States case. At this time in our history, the United States is currently in the Vietnam War, widely regarded as the most controversial war in U.S. history. On June 17, 1967, at the height of the war, the Pentagon developed the Vietnam Study Task Force, whose purpose was to create a detailed study on the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War for future historians. This study was put into a book located in the Pentagon with nearly 7,000 pages containing detailed analysis and government documents. On this task force was military analyst Daniel Ellsberg. While working on this task force, Ellsberg came across this book and was heavily disturbed with the information he found. Ellsberg had become deeply against the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War, so he and his colleague Anthony Russo began secretly copying these papers with the intention to inform the nation. This information was so important due to the fact that at this point, the United States had never officially declared war on Vietnam, but had been heavily involved in the ongoing conflicts for over 6 years, with the American people never having known the full specifications of their government's involvement. Ellsberg brought the copies to Neil Sheehan, a journalist at the New York Times. On June 13, 1971, the New York Times published their article, Vietnam Archive, Pentagon Study Traces 3 Decades of Growing U.S. Involvement, with direct excerpts from the Pentagon's confidential study. This, of course, became a massive ordeal, with other papers such as the Washington Post writing their own articles. In retaliation, the Nixon administration sought a restraining order against the New York Times and Washington Post that would force them to stop publishing these articles. Meanwhile, Ellsberg and Russo were both brought to prison and said to be put on trial for the criminal charge of espionage, which would result in them having to serve a maximum of 115 years in prison. The New York Times, Washington Post, and the Nixon administration went to the Supreme Court. The government sought to enforce prior restraint or pre-publication censorship on the publications. They justified this by arguing that Ellsberg and Russo were both in violation of the Espionage Act of 1917 and that the contents of the article put national security at risk. Well, the New York Times and Washington Post believed that this prior restraint infringed on the freedom of the press in the First Amendment. The court ruled in favor of the publications, deciding that the censorship was unjustified and that the press has the right to publish the information. This ruling declared that the government does not have the power to censor the press based on it having a negative connotation towards them. Shortly afterward, Ellsberg was cleared of all charges and went on to become an activist for other government whistleblowers. On May 4, 2011, the entirety of the Pentagon papers were declassified and made available to the public. These are my sources. Thank you.